All right, welcome everybody. My name's Ashley Smith. I'm going to be facilitating this meeting. I'm a member of the Tempest Collective. The Tempest Collective is a revolutionary socialist organization, a national organization, and we've got a chapter here in Burlington, and probably a lot of you know us from Palestine solidarity work and union work and many other social movement activist things. So tonight we're going to talk about what in the world happened in this election, what does it mean for the left, and what does it mean for building a resistance in our country to the oncoming Trump regime, which if you're watching the appointments, it looks terrifying. He's appointing just a cabinet of horrifying individuals who oppose the programs that they're going to be overseeing. So we're headed for a nightmare of attacks on all workers and divide and conquer tactics and big giveaways to the rich in our country, plus more militarism abroad, despite Trump's protestations of being a pacifist. But before we get the panel started, I first want to just not give a moment of silence, but a cheer for the stepping down of our police chief here in Burlington, John Murad, which is great. Good riddance to John Murad, who was an opponent of Black Lives Matter, opponent of oversight of the police, and wanting to beef up the police department, mainly in the interest of real estate developers that want a clean and safe city for middle-class people moving up here from out of state. So if people saw the big profile that was done in the New York Times of John Murad, it was one of the most repugnant advertisements for Burlington, where basically he was keeping everybody safe for people who wanted to move to Burlington and enjoy the mansions that they want to buy and the B&Bs that they want to rent. So good riddance to John Murad, and we'll just have to fight the next police chief, whoever it is, because police chief by definition are enemies of humanity. So we have two wonderful panelists today, and I'll introduce them in their order of speaking. First, we have Antonio Golan, who is a professor up at University of Vermont, and he's a member of the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation and Labor for Palestine. And after Antonio, we've got Paul Fleckenstein, who's a member of the Tempest Collective and part of the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation, and has been spearheading the petitioning for apartheid-free communities ballot measures in Vermont, and especially here in Burlington. So without further ado, Antonio, take it away.
Okay. I did not know that John Murad stepped down.
Yeah.
So good stuff. Before I get to sort of the main points that I'm going to talk about, I don't know that I have kind of any answers about the election, or kind of, that my analysis should be kind of is kind of more insightful than anyone else's. So just, I'll start there. And I'll also, in the name of transparency, say like a lot of the things I'm going to say, if not all, were things that I was already thinking about. The election, if I'm honest, it didn't provoke some revolution in my thinking. So with that said, I looked this morning at the New York Times, and Trump's at 76.5 million votes. Harris is at close to 74 million. Trump right now is at 50%, though it looks like he will be under 50% once all the votes are counted. Harris clearly lost the popular vote and clearly lost every battleground state. Kind of what happened, or maybe, beginning with what didn't happen in the past. The Democratic Party has talked a lot about Bernie Sanders not conceding in time and this hurting Hillary Clinton's chances. Back some decades, it was Ralph Nader, hanging chads. There's always kind of been some go-to excuses, which are not really available to the Democratic Party right now. The one that sort of somewhat bizarre critique that the Democratic Party is making, self-critique, is that the Democratic Party was too woke or too to the left. this is, obviously not true. The strategy of the Democratic Party is always to seal off the left and fight for the center, never recognizing that there's anyone to their left. And in this fight for their center, they, allied with Dick Cheney, which is kind of utterly bizarre if you have any memory of the last 20 years. So some thoughts on where we're at right now. So one thing I'm a firm believer is that apathy is not a problem of the system of liberal democratic capitalism, but rather one of the many ways that elites perpetuate power. So political disengagement is not sort of a failure of the system, but something that is directly baked in. In this election, we see it in that the Democratic Party has refused to mobilize its, potential base with genuine proposals that would bring about genuine change. For me, and I don't think this is terribly controversial in this room, the Democrats are a truly conservative party in that they are the defenders of the system, and the Republicans are reactionaries. The Republicans want to go back. This is an issue in the current election, or in the election that just passed, because capitalism is in a state of crisis. The market is unable to in any way address the issues that we're facing. Here in the United States, we have new generations that are clearly worse off than their parents. It's not only kind of like a new generation, but now we have several generations of people that are worse off than their parents. And we have a perpetual and unending housing crisis beginning in 2008. We never really fully recovered from that, and now we're kind of battling this inflation that, among other things, is affecting the accessibility of housing, whether it's purchasing homes or simply renting homes. And Burlington is kind of an extreme example, but not is not an exception to any rule. It's not unique in that regard. In this election, the Democratic Party has ignored issues that people care about, working class problems, and maybe this is controversial, and there might be some discrepancy in what I'm about to say. I would argue that Trump engages in class politics. It's not. I wouldn't say the class politics that we would recognize. We in this room would recognize, but many people that, when asked about why they vote for Trump, and of course there's myriad reasons why people vote for any one candidate, but many people point to an authenticity, a realness, or that they feel heard when Donald Trump speaks. And I think he certainly plays on people's racism, xenophobia, transphobia, etc. But he does, I would argue, bring an authenticity that the Democrats, I don't think, can replicate. We see this again in very general terms in the split ticket voting that was a reality in this election. This idea of being heard, of realness, has been voiced and expressed by many people that have commented on why they voted, for example, voted for AOC and then voted for Donald Trump. We get probably a more precise vision of this in the case of Rashida Tlaib in Dearborn, Michigan. Rashida Tlaib did twice as well as Kamala Harris did in Dearborn. So the numbers are: Harris got 36%, Rashida Tlaib got 62% of the vote in Dearborn. Jill Stein got 15 there in Dearborn. Rashida Tlaib is a woman. She's an Arab, Palestinian, radical. To the left, I can't think of a single issue that Rashida Tlaib would be not to the left of Harris on, and yet Rashida Tlaib drastically outperformed Harris in Dearborn, Michigan. this is anecdotal. It's kind of hard to kind of piece together piece together the landscape, but I think there's kind of clear indications that this idea that the Democratic Party is too far to the left is, not only on its face ridiculous, but it's now borne out by the facts on the ground. And even if you were to argue that this is not, you can't expand this analysis to every district or to every city in the city, it does point to a disconnect between the Democratic Party and a working class base, in this case in Dearborn. Some ideas to where to go from here. I talked before about apathy, and about apathy being something that's baked into liberal democratic capitalism, which allows kind of to elites to operate unimpeded. I think mobilization is the antidote to that, and mobilization and organizing is the antidote to that. Personally, I'm a populist. Not that every populist movement is good, but I do see politics as the people versus elite at a very kind of fundamental level, and I would say that left populism has a place in the U.S. political landscape, and could be a potential socialist vehicle for change. If I were to be a little bit more specific about socialist party building, how we might develop socialist parties, and I'm speaking in the plural intentionally, I would point to, I came up with 5 things as I was preparing for today. 5 things to do within socialist parties. One is obviously party building, creating these parties. Education, electoralism. I do think electoralism has to have a robust place in a socialist party amongst other areas of operation and in conjunction with those. And then I would add syndicalism. I think unions will be kind of tremendously important in developing a left strategy within the current context, and certainly protests in the street. And this I would suggest is a way of addressing the climate crisis, the Palestinian genocide, our housing issues, police brutality, and so on and so forth. The final thing I'll end by saying is that I'm a firm believer in social capital, this idea that politics and civic engagement requires connections amongst people. So kind of what we're doing right here in terms of establishing networks, I think that'll certainly be a crucial part of left politics and socialist politics moving forward. That's it.
Thanks, Antonio. That was very interesting. A lot of great points, and a good lead-in, I think, to what I want to do, which is I want to first step back a little bit and look at the historical position that we're in at this election shows. And I think one thing you can see is Democratic Party liberalism exhausting itself as an alternative for people who are oppressed and suffering under the system. The Democratic Party offered joy and basically gaslighting as an alternative to Trump, right? Everything is better than you think it is. So very condescending, and it lost Harris 8 million votes compared to what Biden got, and gave the election to Trump. Did the Democratic Party in this process abandon the working class, and that's the reason for the loss? Well, we can discuss whether the Democratic Party, since it was founded in 1828, has ever, thank you, has ever represented the working class. I'd offer the answer no, that the changes come from elsewhere in society, not from a capitalist party. But it is good at this point to look at the kind of dual function of a capitalist party in a state. One, and the Democrats have been the world's most successful party in doing this since 1828 or so. They, one, managed the conflicts and the relations between different different areas of industry and sectors in capital. So there's a rules-based system for competition, and the system is predictable. The second thing that the Democrats do is function to contain and repress opposition to the system. So since capitalism relies on oppression and exploitation, we resist, and that can challenge the system. The role of the Democrats has been to contain and suppress that resistance. So think of the labor struggles of the 1930s or the rebellions around civil rights and Vietnam War in the 1960s. The Democratic role has been to contain and suppress those. Palestine has been a challenge, so that's a good thing for our side and our movement. We can maybe get to that later. Capitalism is a system of crises. That's how it functions. So we have economic crises, we have a climate crisis, migration crisis, crisis of imperial competition between the US and China and Russia. These tensions are increasing. Crisis doesn't mean the end of capitalism. It means it forces some adaptations to the system. The main thing in my lifetime has been neoliberalism. So that's since the early 80s or late 1970s to restore capitalist profitability and growth, suppress wages, cut regulations, open up world markets for exploitation and investment, attack unions, cut the budget. So I was looking back today. When Bill Clinton came into power in 1993, one of his first priorities was something called the National Performance Review of Government. And this was set up to aim for a government that's less expensive, more efficient, that de-emphasizes any entitlement, and that empowers the individual, right? So we can see echoes of this in Trump's new government efficiency thing, which is operating on a much more vicious and draconian level, of course, but you see it here as well. So this response to the crisis has benefited capitalists and the wealthy, but for most people, it's not helped. It's not been a benefit. So especially since the financial crisis of 2008, and this is internationally, you've seen that establishment, kind of the centrist political parties have been rejected largely for a movement to the right and the far right, and to the left, the populist right parties, Europe, Latin America. Haven't seen that in the US because the move has been far right, proto-fascist right, in the Republican Party, and the Democrats have followed suit and moved to the right as well. So there's been no electoral expression in the United States for rising discontent on the left. So given the nature, and the kind of another thing I read recently is that kind of along the lines of what I'm getting to, and votes rejecting the establishment status quo, is that in advanced capitalist countries, every government that was in power during the pandemic has lost percentage of the vote subsequent to that. So there's an international kind of rejection of status of whatever government is in power because they've not been able to address real grievances that millions of people have. So Trump and the far right have become the anti-establishment party for people who want to reject a miserable status quo. And that goes along with bigotry, racism, sexism, xenophobia, all the kind of crazy, insane scapegoating and mystification of the world. And the Democratic Party pose, well, we're defending democracy against fascism. But what they mean by democracy is a very limited notion of that term. It means some rules-based order of governing the system, checks on executive power. Not what we mean. That's some representation of popular will and interest in the policies of the government. That's not their interest. As a result, we have Trump in power, who's going to test all the limits on unchecked executive power, right? So he's going after his enemies, broadly the left, all advances in social movements, unions, transgender folks, women, immigrants, social programs, programs for people with disabilities. I mean, everything's under the gun at this point. So, a couple last thoughts on the alternative and how we think about the way forward. First off, it is not to offer advice to the Democratic Party on how to win in 2 years or in 4 years. That's been the strategy of the dominant strategy of the left in the United States for the last decades. I think that's not the strategy. We don't need better demands. We don't need more promises from elites that they either have no intention of fulfilling or they have no ability to fulfill, given the gridlock of the system, the real crises of capitalism. So we don't need that. We don't need false promises. And I think there are a lot of people who are disenchanted with, doesn't matter. People are going to be disenchanted with Trump the next election. So there's a big factor of throwing out whoever's in power for someone else, and maybe things will be better. Maybe they said one thing that could improve my life, right? So there's a lot of that going on. So that's a strategy, as many of us have said, kind of paves the way, like putting all your focus on the next election, the false promises. It paves the way for the further growth of the right, of the far right, because there's a segment that has a plan and ambition to drive this as far as they possibly can in the way that Trump is going. And they prey on the inability of the Democrats and the establishment to solve the grievances in society or address the crises in any meaningful way. So the last thing I want to say is that the alternative is not about, the promises or the better demands. It has to be about a different kind of method, a different means of struggle. And that's where I think we need to root ourselves. So that's in mass, democratic, popular organization. And I think for us, it starts resisting Trump. This broad sale attack on everyone is going to provoke resistance, very weak resistance from the blue states and whatever coalition of Democratic governors are going to come together, because they're mainly interested in the next election, right? On our side, people are going to be fighting and trying to figure out ways to resist this stuff. So I think that's where socialists need to be, because those infrastructures of dissent and struggle are invaluable, and they're what need to be rebuilt, and they are the necessary part of offering a horizon that's different than what we've been living through for the last decades, and that is a socialist horizon that offers an idea and also some convincing strategy of getting to something radically different that is based on what people need and our aspirations and what the planet needs to survive. So I think there's a lot to talk about in all of this, so I'm going to stop there and look forward to the discussion.
So thanks both of you for those talks, and I do want to just give people a heads up that we're going to organize a panel for December 10th that's going to have a lot of movement leaders on it about how we can build a resistance under Trump. So that will include people from the Palestine Coalition, it will include people from the union movement, it will include migrant justice, most centrally because migrants are going to be the first line of attack from the Trump administration, abortion rights advocates. So it's an attempt to pull together our side to talk about how we build a resistance in this new circumstance. The other thing that people should know is that the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation has reaching out to 40 different organizations to try and build a summit of organizational leaders to talk about how we can build an organized resistance to Trump's attack here in the state. So that hopefully will generate an even bigger movement panel teach-in about how we build the resistance. So I did want to just flag those things for everybody. But if you want to jump on the stack, just raise your hand, introduce yourself. I'll keep a stack of speakers, and all questions, disagreements, issues, all fine on the table, so people raise their hands and jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Patrick. I was curious, obviously the result of the 2024 election was devastating. I was also incredibly disheartened by the performance of the Green Party. And I thought there was a lot more energy behind Josiah Bush Ware than previous election cycles. Just kind of curious, based on the polling that we initially saw, especially from in Dearborn, Michigan, with Arab American voters and Muslim voters specifically, and how those polls contrasted with the results of the election.
Could you just summarize that, just briefly?
Yeah, there's a question about the performance of the Green Party in the election, and why it polled less good than people anticipated. So that's a great question, and the question of third party in electoral politics is a great question. So people up here don't have to answer, they just talk for a long time, so if other people want to join. Yeah, if you guys want to circle up too, it's fine, whatever. Just go ahead. Anybody want to jump in on Patrick's question or raise any other issue? Go ahead, Nolan.
I unfortunately don't have enough background about the Green Party to be able to speak to that. I'll let more knowledgeable people go in there. But one of the things that I come back to in terms of trying to make sense out of this election is I keep going back to 2016, in which you had two kind of simultaneous insurgent candidates from both sides. You had, it was very clear that people were fed up with the status quo and they wanted something different. And you simultaneously had Trump as an insurgent candidate in the Republican Party, and you had Bernie Sanders as an insurgent candidate within the Democrats. They were both, I think, kind of against all odds and against all expectations, incredibly popular. And on the Democratic side, they were successfully able to snuff out Bernie's campaign and go with an establishment candidate, whereas the Republicans were unsuccessful in stopping the rise of Donald Trump. And, I just keep going back to that because, ever since then, the Trump has now reshaped the Republican Party in his image, and it is now the party of Trump, whereas the Democrats have been able to, they continue to run as the party of the status quo at a time when people want to burn the system to the ground, right? And so you have this situation where I really think that so many people out there are voting for this monster in Trump because they just want something different. Change of some kind. The status quo cannot stand anymore as it is, and they are looking for something different. Trump is offering that, and the problem is there is no counter to it right now. Right? I absolutely believe that people, Bernie Sanders' message was incredibly popular. I haven't been able to really dig into the stats around this. I'd be interested if other folks have, but some of the populations where that Trump has grown in 2024, particularly among Latinos and other working class voters, are populations that Sanders was incredibly popular with. So those were some of his strongest demographics that he resonated with. I don't want to pretend like Sanders was going to be our savior, but I just think that it just speaks to the openings that are there for left-wing politics and for an alternative and a change, but it's simply not on offer right now. And as a result, almost basically out of desperation, you see large segments of the population turning to Trump, but I don't think it's a cause for hopelessness. There's other things I would love to talk to, or maybe other folks can talk about, AOC doing that survey of voters who, she said, hey, folks who voted for me and Trump in a way that resonated with people. I think that speaks to where the population's at right now.
Got Helen next, and then the stack is open if anybody else wants to jump in.
Do you want to put a microphone over here?
Sure.
So why don't we turn
Do you want to get us to get a
You can do the Phil
People-
Donahue routine.
People can just actually use this.
Yeah.
And so,
So Helen, go ahead.
I think.
Don't worry.
Okay. I think I was going to say that for me, the most important thing is that 2/3 of the electorate did not, 2/3 of the electorate did not vote for Trump.
Yeah.
And that's what gets missed out. Every time you hear this repetition of landslide victory, it wasn't a landslide. Like, most people do not like Trump. Most people did not vote for Trump. We have a lousy two-party system that means when the second party is not offering anything that the majority want, they won't vote for it. And that means by default that the other party gets to win. So the question of the third party, it's an interesting question. I don't think it's an easy one to answer, but my perception is that most people this time around were not convinced the third party option was going to make any difference. And not many people voted for any of them. And the NADA campaign was, in my lifetime, the one that had the biggest movement around it. And people really had a hope that that could reorient the whole political system. This time around, I don't think any of the candidates had that kind of mass base that would allow people to think, well, at least I can vote for them because they're closer to what I want. The other thing that I heard in terms of, population, most people who are disaffected with the system didn't vote for Trump. Trump got his base. He has people who are pissed off with the wrong things, who were very, who Trump gave everything to them. But I don't think that it's the majority of working class who voted for him. So, this idea that Trump didn't give them what they wanted, well, no, that's why they didn't mostly vote for him. In other words, it's a really skewed system that gave him the appearance of doing much better than he really did. That, for me, is the thing that's the most heartening. But it's still a very disheartening moment because Trumpism has the power right now, and the prospects for a change to the two-party system seem really far away. That's why, I like the emphasis from both of our speakers on building from grassroots, building movements, rather than jumping to the situation of trying to build a third party, which I think we're a long way away from.
So the list is open. I'll just call on myself. The key stat to remember about the election is 36% of people didn't vote. That's disproportionately working class and disproportionately multiracial. So what the two candidates did is basically split 50-50, 60% of the electorate. So it's really important to keep that in your mind because then it clarifies everything. So that means Helen's stat is right. 2/3 didn't vote for Trump. It's 50% of 60%, which is like what, 30% of the electorate, which is really important to remember because I think a lot of liberals who don't understand class and are fundamentally elitist and insulated from the reality of working class life have no ability to explain two things. One, why so many people didn't vote in the most important election of our lifetime when there was imminent fascism, even though Biden is making an orderly transition to the candidate he denounced as a Nazi, so think about the madness of that. So they can't understand why people wouldn't vote, and they wouldn't understand, and they can't understand why Trump's anti-establishment rhetoric appeals to deeply unhappy people. Like, that's the other thing that we have to explain, because there's no doubt that Trump's appeal does connect with a section of the working class and gives false answers to real problems. And we have to understand that, so we don't do like the liberals, like Rebecca Solnit and others, who say America's a right-wing country. We have to write off all these people, as Biden says, as garbage, and as Hillary Clinton said, a basket of deplorables. That kind of political position is fine for capitalist liberals, but not for working class people. So for me, that's important to remember. And second point is about the Republican and Democratic Party being reformable. The Republican Party, Trump could take over because it's a capitalist party and he's a capitalist. The Democrats are a capitalist party and cannot be taken over by a socialist because they're a capitalist party, and they have wealthy donors, a party bureaucracy, and an army of elected officials that reinforce that reality. As a politician said when Sanders denounced them for abandoning the working class, well, we can't embrace the working class because it would piss off our donors. Exactly right. And so then the question of your question, Patrick, about the Green Party, I think that there's a whole layer of the left under the influence of Bernie Sanders that have put the place where we're weakest at the ballot box as the priority. And the reality is, if you look at the constitutional order as it's set up, it is utterly undemocratic, with the Electoral College extremely difficult to get on the ballot, and then you've got the Senate, and you've got the Supreme Court, and you've got all these institutional structures that make it very hard to win anything through elections. And so the process of making sausage, if you get elected, narrows down so much of what you can actually win to pablum, to nothing, so that you disappoint people even if you get elected on a radical program. So I think we have to flip the order of priority and understand any real third party in the United States has to be primarily an activist party, so that we can build our social forces to crack through the constitutional impediments that the U.S. state has built in its very foundations, all the way back to 1787 when the slaveholders wrote the Constitution. So we have to understand how deep the problem is and where we should pick the battles first. The biggest lesson for me is look at when Biden got elected, why did he get elected? Because we had 4, 5, 6 years of unrelenting struggle before Trump got elected and during his term in office. And that gave people hope that we could change things. The problem is that got funneled into a party that disappointed, demoralized, and demobilized everybody. And then when confronted with an actual new movement, that is the Palestine Solidarity Movement, what did it do? Repress it. The Democratic Party mayors of city after city repressed the movement, and their liberal administrators on college campuses collaborated in the repression of the encampments. So I think we have to understand that our power is there, and the Democrats are an enemy of that, and the Republicans are equally an enemy to that, and we have to build our social forces, which I think are there to be organized. A new trade union movement can be built in these conditions. Palestine Solidarity can be built. A new women's movement can be built. Defense of migrants can be organized and built. The problem is we're going into this new moment under Trump when he is coming like an avalanche, and we've been sitting on our hands for 4 years, honestly. So we're going to be mainly in a defensive situation, protecting people from getting deported from our farms in Vermont. That's going to be task number one. Defending every little bit of the social programs that we have, from Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's Department of Government Efficiency. Like, they're coming for us. And so we're going to have these defensive struggles. So I think if we build into it that we have to build a new party out of those defensive struggles and offensive demands that we build around it, then we can eventually contest at the ballot box. I think the Green Party starts at the ballot box and ends at the ballot box and has no activist component whatsoever. So you can't really promise things you can deliver if you're not delivering it each day of the year so that it's credible when you're running for office. Sorry, I ranted for too long. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Go ahead, Lionel.
I just wanted to, I don't know like how much this has been voiced before, but one of the things that I think, like people talk about the idea of the struggle, like I think about the Republicans. right, the right wing of that Republican Party, under the leadership of people like Ralph Reed and other right-wingers of the Republican era, had a plan that really started, I mean, I want to say in the 90s. I mean, it could be earlier than that. But their plan was, again, to not consider, like, the political elections, right, national political elections. That one of the things that they told their followers was to organize, again, at the grassroots level. Don't start with the presidency. Start with your local school board, right, and get right-wingers on your local school board, on your city council, state governments. So that when they were ready for when somebody like Trump did emerge, there was this apparatus in place to support his election at the local level. And I think that one of the things that they were able to do, or that Trump was able to do in his, I don't know, blind squirrel gets a nut kind of way, is to tap into this organizational structure that had been in place, since the 90s. And so all of a sudden they're ready to roll out their programs. Like, in Texas, I think they're getting ready to approve a curriculum that's based in tenets of the Bible, right? This wasn't something that's overnight. I mean, this is something that they've been planning because they started small, right, organizationally at the local level. And I think that I agree that just starting a third party and thinking that you're going to win real power is probably fool's gold, because there isn't that kind of infrastructure in place to support that movement on a national level.
Other thoughts, comments, questions, anxieties, worries? What's coming?
Well, they've got it all. I mean, the pigs have won. I mean, they got what they've won. It's Supreme Court, presidency, the Senate, the House of Representatives. Right? And that means that, and what I worry about is that what they're looking to do is to change things to such a degree that it is difficult, if not impossible, to change them back. Right? And that's what really scares me. It's not, the idiot in chief. It's the people that support this idiot in chief and all the governmental structures they are now in control of.
Well, one thing is that they can't, they do have all the powers, but they don't have the ability to stabilize or fix the crises that Paul talked about, that are absolutely everywhere in capitalism. And so they won't actually be able to, address inflation. It seems extremely unlikely that they're going to, provide better paying jobs or any of the things that ordinary people need. And that's what I was trying to say before, was not that no working class people voted for Trump, but the working class weren't the main base for Trump. And the main base, small business, now some crazy capitalists too, they have a very wealthy base. And yes, they did make false appeals to regular people, and some went for them. Those are not going to see anything delivered. So that's one thing for us to remember, is that they provided false solutions to the problems that are real, and they're not going to be able to solve those problems. It's not necessarily a cheery prospect either, because it's like instability and more crises. But again, it does make us, it corrects the false impression that the entire country has gone over to a Trumpist agenda. And that gives us more of a sense of the ability to build and to build movements.
Other thoughts? You guys want to jump in? Anything from up here? Okay. Ken? Sure.
I think it's a really good point about the instability of the system, because it will continue, as Helen said, like the middle class insecurity that Trump is playing on is only going to get worse. Like nothing's going to stop the consolidation of capital, the squeeze on small business. Trump's tariffs are going to raise prices, bring inflation. This is chaotic stuff. Small business has the least capacity to withstand these kinds of shocks. Yeah. So that's going to create tension and conflict in the ruling class, right? All of this conflict and tension, and as the crisis gets expressed politically in the ruling party, in some ways, or between them and capital, it creates some opportunity for our side, right? Because they're not going to have the same grip and legitimacy that Trump claims right now. And we saw this last time, with a lot of the Trump things that kind of, they're pushed back, they don't work, so it ends up losing legitimacy. But they're definitely, they have a plan of, I call it kind of permanent revolution, that they want to drive these things so deep, change the culture, change expectations, change ideology. They want to drive this. So, we want to do something similar in changing capitalism. We don't want to do it undemocratically and in an authoritarian way, but we want to challenge capitalist norms. We want to challenge oppression. We want to challenge exploitation. We want to challenge racism that's built into the system. Only kind of for our side, for the past decades, the dominant thing has been to measure everything up, whether it's acceptable to the other capitalist party, which puts a limit on it, which the far right did not recognize in the Republican Party. It just pushed, right? So there is some ambition for revolution there that we have, but we should have in a liberatory direction. Last thing on Jill Stein, a lot of people, people mostly voted for her, I think, because of Palestine. Yeah. Jill Stein was the protest vote that seemed to have the most recognition, the most airplay, a good position. So it was a protest vote. I don't think it went too far beyond that for most people in terms of the program and kind of other planks that she may have had. At least people I've talked to here in Vermont in the coalition who voted and campaigned for Jill Stein. So it was a protest, but I agree with what people said. Unless you have a social movement base, there's real limits to kind of what she can attract in a vote, let alone kind of a longer term, kind of what comes after this election. It is kind of a one-off thing every 4 years when she runs.
Maybe we should call it permanent counter-revolution in the case of Trump, not permanent revolution.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, that's good. Permanent counter-revolution. Yeah.
I mean, I think the point of the sort of the Green Party or PSL or a lot of these, I'm thinking of the ones that ran candidate, Cornel West, that ran candidates here in Vermont. The Ralph Nader campaign, at least as I remember it, did have some legs. It was kind of like a genuine
global justice movement.
Yeah, it was a genuine campaign. He had made an effort to get into the debates, not successful. But it's when I see Jill, and I think it's great that these people run, but I think without social movement support, but also without kind of an organizational structure, I didn't really hear much from Jill Stein directly. It wasn't like Jill Stein came to Vermont and tried to this would be a state that's ripe for a left-wing third party because it's sort of safe in some ways, but it just Jill Stein every 4 years runs and the Green Party runs a candidate and then we won't hear from them for 4 years. So I think that there destined to be protest votes. And I think a real third party requires heavy-duty organization from the grassroots and building, engaging in that kind of building activity that's really kind of banal and unglamorous compared to.
Great. I just have one line of race about them being in power. I think you're right, and we should be very worried about this. Like, they are going for broke. If you look at the appointees, personnel is policy. You look at who he's appointing, crackpots, rapists, the billionaires, and Christian fundamentalists. The guy he's appointed to be ambassador to Israel doesn't believe Palestinians exist and wants what he calls Judea and Samaria reabsorbed into Israel because it's their natural homeland. That is, forget Palestine from the river to the sea. It's Israel from the river to the sea for Mike Huckabee, who's the new ambassador. So domestically, internationally, you look at the bigots he's put in charge of the Office of Homeland Security and the former ICE head and Stephen Miller. These people do want to deport 12 million people. I mean, that's their battle plan, and they've got it much more coherent. They got a whole cabinet, and they got all three branches of government. That said, they're an amalgam as a coalition. It's really important to understand this. You have oligarchs, small business owners, and sections of workers, Latinos, and more black men that voted for Trump. That all doesn't add up into a coherent social movement. They're wrought with internal contradictions, and they're getting power in a system that's fundamentally crisis-ridden, in which they are going to piss people off and they're going to overreach. So they're going to go for broke. They'll try and do too many things that will provoke resistance and begin to pull apart the amalgam that they have built. And I think that's important to understand and look abroad to understand the dynamics of what we're about to go through. Think about big right-wing governments. The Tory party in Britain, Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, and Narendra Modi in India. What did all those three parties just suffer? Massive defeats. The biggest defeat in the history of the Tory party when they just lost this most recent election, because they're overseeing a crisis-ridden system. Modi had his electoral majority winnowed to very, very narrow margins. Bolsonaro was driven out of office, and the guy he put in jail is now the president of Brazil. And the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, a right-wing, imperialist, horrible, hawkish party, just suffered an enormous setback electorally because all the governments are presiding over a deeply crisis-ridden capitalist system. So the rule that we should anticipate is instability. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. The worst thing from my vantage point, the biggest danger is we will have a resistance, and then it'll be another march to the polls that will deliver this resistance to the Democrats, who will then start the cycle again. Get in office, betray people, or disappoint people, and then the right offers even more scary solutions. And so we have to break the cycle in a more fundamental way and say, we have to build our social struggles, we have to fight for our demands, and anybody who gets elected is accountable to us, not to donors, and not to the system that they're getting elected in, and with no illusions that they're going to deliver the victories. We have to win it. Like, the big advances were never won by electoral means. 1930s, that was mass strikes unlike we've ever seen in the history of the United States. 1960s, mass civil rights movement, anti-war protests that disrupted the foundations of American society. That's when the system will cough up the reforms we want. So that should be the beginning point, because it reframes where we think social power lies, not at the ballot box, but in the workplace, communities, and streets. Other thoughts, questions, ideas? Go ahead, Nolan.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about that is helpful for me to remind myself of as I'm staring down the barrel of 4 more years of Trump and his agenda, and the damage that he's going to do to the system and everything around it, is just reminding myself that there have been absolutely brutal authoritarian regimes all throughout history that have been brought down. Yeah. Right. So, I think that there can we're going to need to fight against this feeling on the left that like all hope is lost, or just you know, sort of cowering in fear under this like wave of repression that's going to be very real, that's going to come down. But it is by no means, you know, unwinnable for our side, right? Like, again, absolute, you know, dictatorships, brutal dictatorships have been brought down by, you know, by people mobilizing, you know, ones that don't have any semblance of a real court system. You know, when we want to freak out about the right-wing turn of the courts and the Supreme Court, or, you know, these things that are going to come down, people throughout history have overcome far more serious and repressive regimes than what we are facing. So, you know, I think we need to keep moving forward. I do, though, think, you know, one of the sort of questions that I have, I think an open question for what things are going to look like for the left moving forward is, you know, what is the level of mobilization going to be like, at least, you know, I think both in the short term and in the long term, and I mean, like, you know, over the next year and then over the next 4 years, because I do think, you know, I get the sense right now that there is an extreme sense of like disorientation and you know, defeatism on the left right now that is understandable. I mean, you know, I think that, you know, people survived 4 years of Trump, and then Biden came into power, and there's this feeling of like, oh my God, that was a nightmare, but we survived it, and it's behind us now. And now you know, Trump has come back and is coming back with a vengeance. And I think that there, you know, is going to be a sense of that disorientation and defeatism, at least in the short term, that I think is real. I think we're going to need to likely acknowledge that that's going to be a reality, but not think that that is going to be the permanent state of things, and looking for where is the resistance happening, you know, where can we mobilize? And I'm hopeful that unions can play a really important part in that role, you know, despite how small unions, you know, still are. I think one of the themes coming out of the past, you know, 5-6 years has been this, you know, wave of working class activism in the workplace, and the moves towards unionization. These things are, you know, small and weak, but they're there, and they're heading in the right direction. And I think that unions and working class mobilization will be able to play a real role in helping to cohere and build back up that, you know, a left-wing movement that is going to fight against some of these things. I'm really excited about that coalition panel, you know, getting together of all the kind of left-wing forces. And then just the last thing that I'll say is, like, I think going back to that question of the Green Party, and what, you know, running candidates, I do think that for us on the left, you know, I envision in my head like this idea of like a resurgent labor movement that is building, you know, that is coalescing, you know, kind of radical left labor and organizing with other left-wing movements, and out of that a resurgent left labor formation that is really gaining ground on the ground. Out of that growing, you know, a candidate, you know, for the formation of a party or the running of a candidate that is but that is like the tip of the iceberg to what has been grassroots mobilization, right? The power is in that base, and yes, we might run candidates to advance our interests on another level, but like that's only one tiny component of the more serious organizing work. And I think what's happened is so many of these parties are skipping the grassroots mobilization, the building of power from the ground, and just going straight to the running for office. And I just think that is forever going to be a dead end. You know, that we have to start with that building power from the bottom up, and then from that can grow candidates that can, you know, advance those at the electoral level.
Any final questions? First, giving a chance for people who haven't spoken, then I'll grab you, Lionel. Questions, comments, all good. Don't feel intimidated. We're all trying to figure this out. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Izzy.
like on the topic of a path forward, how much the left feels so fractured right now, and I think that like especially amongst young people, like seeing the movement towards Palestinian liberation like fall apart in like when the election came up in terms of like people then voting for Harris and like that. I think like people's politics are just like very tangled, and yeah, like amongst young people especially. And so like out of that, how do we build like a vision of a way forward, like including education, and how much unity is required in terms of like a political platform, or like can a grassroots movement, or like so all these grassroots movements come together and like build something that has a lot of variety. Yeah.
Any other people who haven't spoken, not to put anybody on the spot, but if you got a question or comment, it's all good. Okay, Lionel, and then we'll have these guys wrap it up, and then we'll talk about building our next meeting, the big public meeting we're going to put on.
So I do want to say that eventually I'm going to get to some optimistic stuff. Like what I believe is like the key optimistic thing. But there are two things, because one, I think, and this is the degree even people who didn't vote for Trump didn't understand to the degree that they should have, that the people behind Trump, and even Trump himself, I mean, they're eugenicists. I mean, these are people who believe in white replacement theory. I mean, Stephen Miller is like the spokesperson for white replacement theory. Right, and I think that this has been mentioned before, that there's a clash between this ideological belief and the economy, right? The fact that, right, our economy depends on a lot of the people that they want to deport. I mean, it's the farms, it's the construction business, right? You can't build things without using laborers who are coming from Central America, right? And the fact that they are great workers, right? It's kind of like their attack, right, on the Haitian population in Springfield, Ohio, when, you know, they're going to eat the, you know, again, I won't even repeat that nonsense that was flowing from them, but the fact that, you know, factory owners came out and said, you know, they're here because they're working in these factories and they're great workers. My business is going to die without this labor force. And so I think eventually there's going to be a clash between their policies and the economic problems that these kind of policies cause. And so there's room for hope for that. But for me, the other thing is essentially that this is all being led, the entire Republican Party, by a personality cult. People are voting for Donald Trump because they like him on television, because they think his dance is amusing, because he says wacky things about sharks and electric motors and Hannibal Lecters in his speeches. Right? Are they voting for the policies, or are they voting for this individual because he's entertaining and they think he's a great businessman because of the reality TV show? So to me, the hope is the fact that all of this is this personality cult centered on Trump. If there is no Trump, none of these people are remotely as popular as Trump is, right? If you look at J.D. Vance, I mean, J.D. Vance would probably have a hard time, getting elected dog catcher, right, after people actually heard what he had to say. I mean, Stephen Miller doesn't run for office because he couldn't win anything. That a lot of the people that he's bringing into the government are people that lost elections and are otherwise unemployed. So I do think there's hope in the fact that the entire coalition, I think, has been mentioned, is fundamentally unstable because their positions clash, and also because the head of that movement is 80, and also his own personality is the center point of that movement, and that dude's not going to live forever. His own nutritional habits, if nothing else, will guarantee, unless there's a clone of him out there somewhere right? Like, right, Clonus,
Get happier.
Clonus the part-time. Well, I mean, again, it's a fanciful. maybe that's the explanation for him living as long as he has, right? Various Trump clones donating organs to him to keep him going. But I just want to say that again, I think that's also like a point of optimism that the center ultimately does not hold without Donald Trump.
All right, so let's go to Paul, then Antonio for wrap-ups. Any final thoughts, and then we'll talk about organizing our meetings.
Thanks for that, Lionel. So if you think about the movements that are going to be important in the resistance to what Trump's onslaught is going to be, there are hundreds of thousands or millions of people in those movements who can draw on years of experience and political insight into how the U.S. operates and the two capitalist parties operate. So the immigrant rights movement fought against Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. Right? For their struggle, and some main part, it doesn't matter who's in office or what the kind of ideological front line is of what they're arguing. They're facing deportations, they're facing lack of rights, they're facing, so Palestine movement over the last year especially has grown with a lot of people seeing what the Democrats have done, funded, ideologically supported genocide in Palestine. In some ways, there's no going back on a lot of that, so maybe they voted for Harris, because of the fear of Trump fashion. People have kind of mixed ideas, and not everyone's at the same position of political development, but I think a lot of people did get an incredible political education over the last year because of Palestine. So I think those are, we have to look to that. Also thinking after Roe was overturned, I went to a number of rallies, and they were quite amazing in the sense of a wholesale rejection of the Democratic Party and its utter failure to defend abortion rights. Right. That disappeared after a while, but kind of that sentiment, and there's a level of political consciousness out there among, I think, more people than we think, that understands the dead end of the Democratic Party and that politics on a number of issues, and is open to, well, what's the other path? Convince me. How do I understand it? Which is not easy because people don't have experience and struggle and of winning things and aren't part of collective organizations. Well, it's hard to see kind of what the alternative is, right? If you don't have a sense of your own power and how to win things. And that's been like that, for instance, around abortion rights for a long time. It's been turn it over to the Democratic Party. It's been the claim, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Obama, all claiming, I'm the one who's going to save abortion rights, and it hasn't worked. I think instability at the top, and I think we have to look for where the opportunities are below.
Got 2 mics. So I'll kind of briefly say that I guess my hope is coming out of this. I don't consider that this is our loss. I mean, the election result definitely isn't good, but I don't think Harris, certainly wasn't my candidate. I don't think it's many people's candidate in this room. So in terms of resistance, what I would like to see is people thinking of posing an alternative, a genuine alternative to Trump, not simply trying to put the brakes on Trump. I think that's the Democratic Party's game, to make sure, to check him as much as possible and to keep things to keep the status quo, to maintain the status quo. I think this is an opportunity to provide an alternative, to make the argument that Trump is the product of decades of politics, of a certain political line that that both Democrats and Republicans have participated in, and I think this is a great opportunity to propose a different vision of the world and an alternative political ideology.
Great. Thanks both of you.